Welcome everyone to our Slow Living Summit. This year is the first year we're doing everything virtual. Today we are having a panel on corporate ownership, and we got lots of great folks to speak about that and answer your questions. We'll just wait for folks to join. Give a few seconds for some folks to join. We see the numbers going up and up and up. We'll just wait a few more seconds. Still going up, that's good. Great. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Melissa Harris, I'm the Executive Director of Strolling of the Heifers. And again, this is our, what day is it, Jen? Day 6 of Slow Living Summit, our first ever virtual Slow Living Summit that we did this year. Generally, we meet in person, but we could not this year because of COVID. So we're offering this virtually, and so far it's been working out really, really well. We want to thank our sponsors, Breakthrough Beverage and Meadows Bay Farm, for allowing us to do it in this format. And I'm going to turn it over to Matt Cropp from the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, who is our moderator for the day. Take it away, Matt.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for being here. I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation today. So the focus of this session is on the cooperatives and resilience, and so we're going to be hearing from three folks representing different elements of the cooperative world. Addie Rose Holland from Real Pickles, which is a worker cooperative based down in Massachusetts. Robert Miller of the VSECU, which is a credit union that encompasses the state of Vermont. And then Bonnie Hudspeth, the Neighboring Food Co-ops Association, which represents a number of food co-ops in our region. And so I'll kind of kick this off by giving a little quick overview of the cooperative model and some key elements to understand about it. Many people use co-ops, but few really fully understand the intricacies of what it actually means. So we'll kind of ground the conversation in that, and we'll hear from each of our panelists, have some reactions from panelists in terms of what they've heard from each other, and then open it up for kind of Q&A from the folks watching. So in terms of what a cooperative is, can be really, I think, understood, and you can kind of go really far down a rabbit hole, but I think there's two key elements that are kind of most important to understand. The first is that it's democratically controlled. So in a traditional investor-owned business, you have, where shares are divided up on the basis of capital investment, and governance power tends to be divided up in the same way. So someone who owns 2 shares has 2 votes. Someone who owns 1 share has 1 vote, right? So, dollars equal power. A co-op is a democratic organization, so it's governed on a 1-member, 1-vote basis. And that's not connected to capital investment generally. It's connected to personhood, right? So you have this kind of democratic governance of the firm. The second piece is that whereas a traditional company exists to generate profit in of itself as its ends, right? And then the business it does is the means to the end. The goal of a co-op is to operate on a not-for-profit basis towards its members. And that doesn't mean it's non-profit. There's a subtle difference there. What it means is that its purpose is to deliver service or value to its members, and any surplus or profit that it makes, it returns to those members. And the way it does that is through what's referred to as the patronage fund. So essentially, this plays out in different types of co-ops in different ways, but the core concept is if there's a profit, it's divided up amongst the members, not on the basis of dollars invested, but on the basis of use. And so the different kinds of co-ops define how that money flows. So when you think about different kinds of co-ops, you think about what stakeholder group owns it. Is it the customers? If it's the customers, like a food co-op or a credit union, the profit, those profits can potentially flow back based on the amount of money spent at the company. So for instance, with a food co-op, you spend $1,000 and there's a refund of that profit. You get half the refund of someone who spent $2,000. the co-op is owned by employees, like at Real Pickles, worker cooperative, the profit's not based on the amount spent at the co-op, but on the amount of labor contributed. So that can be tracked through hours worked or W-2 income or some similar metric. But what the co-op is delivering to its members is worker co-op is employment. And then you also have examples of things like producer co-ops, like oftentimes agricultural co-ops look like this, where the goal of the co-op is to market the product of many, say, different farms. And so the return to the members is based on how much of their product was sold through the co-op. So those are kind of the three probably biggest categories of cooperatives. There's a lot of, again, subtlety, and you can break it down in different ways. But that's sort of a core kind of grounding understanding I'm hoping we can all come into this conversation with. So then connecting it to this question of resilience. Historically, and kind of my background before I came into this work developing cooperatives, I spent some time studying the history of the cooperative movement. And something that really is clear is that you often see boom times for cooperatives historically in hard times, right? In times where people are trying to come together to meet each other's needs, there's various challenges. The earliest example that's kind of widely recognized as kind of the first modern co-op of the industrial age was in the 19th century or in the 18th century in England, where you had a problem with millers who would mix powdered white lead into the flour that they were milling. And there were riots, and some folks burned down one of these mills after finding out their children were being poisoned. And they built a mill that they built with subscriptions that they all put in. And that kind of anti-mill movement is sort of seen as one of the earliest examples of this community coming together to meet needs in a trustworthy way, rather than sort of relying on the profit motive to sort of meet those needs. You look at the Great Depression, both in terms of informal things, where these essentially informal worker co-ops that peaked in the early Great Depression with hundreds of thousands of people came together in California, engaged in a variety of tasks before the New Deal kind of kicked in and sort of started to take the edge off of the level of desperation folks were feeling. But you also saw waves of food co-ops being organized, huge wave of credit unions being organized in that era, and again, and even government support for some of that organization coming through the New Deal and other things like that. And so you oftentimes see these historical waves of organizing cooperatives as a response to kind of challenges and stresses that society is feeling. And there's kind of, I think, a core thing to think about as we talk both in the short term about how co-ops been responding to COVID, and the longer term of how our co-ops can position within the context of resilience and the climate crisis, is that because they're not solely driven by profit, but driven by the imperative to meet the needs of their members, there's a certain stewardship element and component that says, okay, so meeting those needs can be defined fairly broadly, and it's do those needs include living in a community where we feel safe and and no one's going hungry, and our access to financial services is on a fair basis, and all of those things that co-ops can allow us to try to access a better world. So I think that there's a lot of really sort of interesting things that all of the co-ops we'll be hearing from today are doing on these various fronts. And so I think we'll start by hearing from Bonnie to talk a bit about the experience in the food co-op world. Then we'll proceed to Rob hearing about the credit union work, and then kind of wrap the presentation portion with Addie talking about Real Pickles. So Bonnie, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit more and get us going?
Absolutely, thanks, Matt. I'm going to share my screen here and talk a little bit about, expand upon what Matt was saying around how, the impact that food co-ops can have in building resilient communities, not only can have, but are having. And so I think one of the first important things to look at is like the context for this, right? What's happening already because of the pandemic? We're seeing our local economies being disrupted already, recession to depression level of unemployment, and the family farmers and farm workers are at even more risk right now because of the impacts of this pandemic. And socially, we're seeing that the most vulnerable people are impacted the most by this pandemic. The systemic injustices that have existed based on race, class, gender, sexual orientation are just amplifying the impacts of this. So what, in thinking about that, resilience and rebuilding resiliently and what co-ops bring to the table, I was really struck by something that Frances Moore Lepay said at the keynote last week, which is like, why on earth are we ever together creating a world that as individuals we would never choose? And so that resonated, because I think it's true. Like, think about what's going on right now. Would we want this for our children, for our babies, for the next generation, for ourselves? I think we can say, for the most part, what's going on, definitely not. So then thinking about, well, what is our vision? What's our collective vision for resilient communities? And what's the future that we envision together? This is why I really want to dig into food co-ops a little bit more, is that food co-ops they help build local skills and assets, just like Matt was mentioning, right? And I'm going to go into a couple of examples of how we've measured impact in our region that our food co-ops are having, to demonstrate some of these examples of how we can rebuild more resiliently in a way that protects people and protects our communities using the structure of cooperatives that are owned and controlled by their communities. So the first example I want to share is that co-ops build on the skills and assets of their communities. They bring people together to identify shared needs and solutions, and then they build power to create stronger communities. And the community owner, members are not just owners, they're also participants. They can run for the board of directors that's elected en masse by the membership, right? And to give an example of that, last year in our region, more than 12,000 people joined their local food co-ops, demonstrating this growing interest in a more sustainable and inclusive future. And another thing about thinking about the difference of what our communities could be if we could pool our own individual limited resources to create economic scale, what could we create together, right? So the co-op structure allows us to do that. Like the average member share in a food co-op in our region is $150, and the average food co-op revenue is 12 million, right? It's creating businesses that as individuals we could never create, but collectively our co-ops are generating $347 million in shared revenue in our region. Also, one thing that's really been highlighted by the pandemic is how exclusive the economy is, who the economy works for, right? It works for big, wealthy, white men in general, is working pretty well for, right? For the CEOs, mega fat CEOs, as my 6-year-old calls them, mega fat CEOs, right? But that's not us, that's not the people, right? So everyone can join our co-ops. We have the potential to build the most inclusive economy if our co-op movement can continue this much needed work to share power, to engage and reflect our communities. And we're being called to do that right now. And we have been called to do that, right? So, our 29 member food co-ops and 10 communities across our region starting food co-ops right now are collectively owned by more than 150,000 people across our region. Imagine what could happen if we mobilize to create a collective vision, right? That's going to benefit all of our communities. And they also, as Matt was mentioning, they're democratically governed, one member, one vote. So they're going to be more representative of their communities than other businesses. With the caveat, as I said before, is we need to recognize that we work together to ensure that we are inclusive of our entire community. And the whole design, when your business is designed to meet the needs of people over prioritizing profit, that means in times of crisis that you can focus on responding to the need in your community. And especially when our health is at stake, when we need businesses that are focused on our needs versus lining the pockets of sole proprietors or distant shareholders that are not even in our communities, right? That focus on member needs is really important if we want to rebuild our communities resiliently. Another thing that's come up is jobs, right? And there's been a lot of highlight and attention on the the essential worker, in quotes, essential workers, right? Who are the essential workers in our communities that are making things run, that are keeping us fed? So our food co-ops build good local jobs that stay in our communities. And what was noticeable from the beginning was that our co-ops were prioritizing the health and safety of both their community members and their staff over profit. And in some cases, they've been losing profit, but keeping at the cost of keeping people safe. But that's what happens when you put people over profit, right? And then I think this is really important in the theme of this whole conference, which is like looking at climate change and looking at how do we build a sustainable food system and economy. And I would say when, Matt mentioned farmer co-ops, control of the local food system matters. Control of the food system matters. And we're seeing that more and more. Food co-ops create a way for us to support local farmers by doing things like buying substantially more local products from farmers, right? When you go into a co-op, our co-ops on average, over a third of the products on their shelves are from the local area. And that means like last year alone, our food co-ops collectively sold over $93 million worth of local products, meaning that money is going back to farmers and producers in our region. Like Addie from Real Pickles, like local producers, yay. And that's important because we see how weak our centralized food system is. We see the weaknesses. Our food co-ops were able to respond to crisis in the supply chain because they had so much diversity. Our average co-op works with 250 local farmers and producers. So when the big box chains were empty, their shelves were empty, our food co-ops you could pick up the phone and call the farmer and say, hey, I heard you have extra milk. Can we bring it in? Or, hey, we're out of eggs. Do you have more to spare? Those types of relationships are key to building sustainable, resilient communities. And then just, looking at our food co-ops, most of our food co-ops have been in business for more than 30 years, which is a long time for any business. And that we have a track record of weathering crises like this before. And as Matt alluded to, the majority of our food co-ops not only survived the Great Recession, but they thrived. And they grew in sales and they grew in members during this time. And 2 of our food co-ops actually opened out of unmet needs coming from the Great Depression. We have 2 food co-ops in our region that are over 80 years old. So thinking about, because the structure of us being rooted in our communities, our food co-ops are not going to abandon our communities in search of higher profits, right? We're going to stay accountable to our communities and really be committed to using the collective wisdom, the collective vision, and the collective resources from our communities to work to rebuild resiliently after this crisis, and to continue working to create a future that we would want, that we would choose. So I think I'm going to stop there and turn it over, and then I'd be happy to talk more and do questions at the end.
Thank you, Bonnie. So now passing on to Rob to talk about VSECU, the credit union, and their approach to these issues.
Great, thanks, Matt. Yeah, hi, I'm Rob Miller. I suppose I'm one of those fat cat CEOs, Bonnie, that your daughter refers to.
Oh no.
I have the honor of being CEO of VSECU, and I've been there for a little over 6 years. And I'll just bring you through, sort of an example, I think, of much of what Bonnie was talking about in the case of a credit union, and a credit union based here in Vermont, because a lot of the things that Bonnie talked about really, I think, resonate with how we actually operate. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about, who we are and what we stand for. I think that's really relevant in today's environment. I'll also spend some time talking about how we've managed through the crisis as an example of what a crisis, how a member-owned co-op actually does respond in a crisis, and some of the challenges it has in doing so, particularly one in the financial space as it exists today. And then talk a little bit more about what the future may look like, and what's changing, and what we need to be conscious of as we move forward. So VSECU is a member-owned credit union, cooperative, financial cooperative that's been, we'll celebrate our 75th year anniversary here in a few years. We're actually over $900 million in assets. That's a typical measurement as to that people usually use when they are talking about banks or credit unions. We have about 70,000, just under 70,000 members throughout the entire state of Vermont. We are statewide. Anyone who lives or works in Vermont can be a member, and we have 9 branches throughout the state, from as far north as St. Johnsbury to as far south as Bennington and Brattleboro and everywhere in between. We like to refer to ourselves as a purpose-driven organization, and our purpose is to improve the quality of life of our membership. And we define that in what we refer to as sustainable terms, sustainable principles, and that means that we're focused in terms of how we impact our quality of life of our members on social, environmental, and economic well-being of our members. And we identify those 3 things on purpose, and you'll see why in a moment. At VSECU, we believe that what actually makes us different, I mean, we operate in a very, like the food business, we operate in what many people consider to be a very commoditized space. I don't think anyone is dying for a new kind of checking account, for example. So it's really important to us that we take our purpose and we embed it in the values of the organization, and therefore into the culture in terms of everything that we do and how we operate. So we believe that our values are the most important thing to the VSECU, and they guide everything we do, and we strive to embed them in our culture and how we deliver our products and services. And those values can really be broken into 2 categories. The first is the cooperative principles that guide cooperatives worldwide. And they're more than talking points for us. They're actually values that guide how we do what we do. Those values are based on the concepts of self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity. And members of cooperatives believe in the ethical values of honesty, openness, social responsibility, and caring for others. And that describes us. That describes how we operate. That describes how we interact with one another as a work community, but it also describes how we strive to interact with our members as well. The other area that might make us a little bit different than other credit unions is that we embrace what we call principles of sustainable banking, or you'll often see us refer to values-based banking. And these are really break into a couple different aspects that I think are unique. Number one, we embrace, we really focus on social and environmental impact and sustainability at the core of our business model. They're not just marketing themes, if you will. It's actually what we're trying to do. And as you can see from our mission, it's part and parcel of our mission. We're grounded in communities and the communities that we serve. We serve the real economy. That sounds like common sense, but not all banks serve the real economy. You remember the crisis of 2008 when other banks were packaging up and reprocessing mortgage securities, and you would hear of things like C-squareds and derivatives, and I could tell you all kinds of other unique things. I had no idea how they actually manage those things. Those are financial economy. Those aren't real economy. We only deal in the real economy. And we're really focused on not only understanding, but meeting the needs of our members and the communities that we serve. We really look to seek long-term relationships with our members and a direct understanding of their needs and their activities. We also have a very long-term, self-sustaining approach to our business that we hope is going to make us more resilient to outside disruptions. And we'll talk about how we've managed through the current one. And then we also believe, as part of our principles of sustainable banking, in transparency and inclusive governance. And Matt talked a little bit about the democratic nature of our governance. Our board is elected. We get almost 7,000 to 8,000 members that vote in our elections every year. I think that's more than most towns in Vermont that vote at their town meeting. I'm not sure of that, but I keep saying it. No one disagrees with me, so I'll just keep saying it. A key theme, I think, throughout all those values is the concept of resilience. And while it may not be named explicitly, it's implicit in how we operate based on the values and what we try to incorporate into our culture. And that is not just in our business operations, but that's in our interactions and serving our members. And also more importantly, or equally importantly, in serving our communities, because we do believe that a rising tide does raise all boats. And if we're able to enhance the vitality of our communities, we're able to improve the quality of life of our members that live in those communities. So let me shift a little bit and talk a little bit about how we've approached the current crisis. You can kind of think of the process by which we've approached it in a couple different areas. First and foremost, protect the safety of our people and our communities. That was that was the first reaction, and still is our primary objective and reaction. What we immediately had to do, though, in really mid-March, is begin to adjust our operations in real time, and oftentimes multiple times a day there for the first couple of weeks, to meet the dynamic needs of our members, of our communities, and of the organization itself. Whether it's within 48 hours, sending half of our organization home to work from home, whether it's closing our branch lobbies and reallocating resources within our organizations to provide services through our drive-thrus or through our call center or other means, but constantly adjusting operations. We're now in a phase where we're kind of beginning to catch our breath, beginning to sort of move to forward-looking strategies for how we exit the crisis stronger, what we're learning as a result of the crisis, and also beginning to more proactively manage emerging enterprise risks, particularly to our balance sheet. We will get to a point, we're not quite there yet, where we'll look to at least reflect on some of the temporary policies and practices and procedures that we've put in place to manage through the crisis, evaluate their efficacy post-crisis, unwind some of them as appropriate, and perhaps not unwind others based on what we've learned. And we're constantly, I would say the last phase is really reflecting on our response in the crisis, adjusting our plan, adjusting our activity, determining appropriate changes to our business and how we serve our members, and really being in touch with our members. We have a very elaborate process for established organizational priorities. We actually do that on a quarterly basis. And we have a very elaborate sort of reflection and brainstorming process that's cross-functional within our organization. We did kind of throw that out the window in mid-March and set objectives that we're still following today. And those objectives really are the health and well-being of our members, the health and well-being of our people, our employees, the financial stability of the credit union, which we can't underestimate in these times, and also making sure that we're continuing to provide community access to basic financial services throughout the crisis. In terms of the things that we did to respond, I would break them into a couple different categories. First and probably foremost, coordinate and communicate and educate. There was a tremendous amount of coordination that had to occur throughout our entire organization. And I would tell you the one reason that we were able to do that, in my view, pretty effectively is because we did it transparently. We actually use a open architecture chat communication tool. We use Teams. We started with Slack. So that everyone has access to the communication that's going on. It's organized in various channels and teams, but everyone has access. So therefore, information goes out there real time in an open and transparent way. Our marketing team immediately pivoted to communicating and educating our members on what's available to them, what are the resources available to them. We've queried our members on some of their challenges and tried to respond in those terms as well. And then just a tremendous amount of communication, both internally and externally, and constant, as I mentioned earlier, reallocation of resources. As we closed the branch lobbies, we essentially reallocated our branch staff to support the call center, to support the interactive teller machines that we have throughout the state, to support processing PPP, small business loans, and the height of that process as well. The second major area is an area that I would just say be safe. This involved changing anything from our internal heating, ventilating procedures to increase our circulation of airflow within our buildings, to supplies, to masks, to face shields, to the plexiglass sneeze guards that now exist in our branches, all that kind of stuff. Reducing in-person meetings to zero, doing everything virtually, eliminating any visits, vendor visits or otherwise, initially closing our branch lobbies to member traffic, really all in an effort to reduce the density of the population in our buildings. We even had to, literally within a week, converted our annual meeting to a virtual event. And actually it changed 3 times in a matter of a week, because literally our annual meeting was right in the middle of when the governor issued his stay home order. And so that was a pretty interesting point. And our annual point-to-point powered by VSECU, which is a fundraising event to benefit the Vermont Food Bank, we've also had to convert to a virtual event, which is actually going pretty well. I've talked a little bit about the sort of the next category, which is the adjust, the reflect, the adapt, the constant sort of iteration of our activities and our processes, and learning from that. And I would say above all else, and this really leads to the future aspect, is taking care of our members. There's a lot of risk for us in the current environment. I can't tell you, I mean, the amount of loan deferments, forbearance, modifications that we've provided to our members is, to say it's at record levels implies that we've ever gotten anywhere close to the levels that we're at today. And we're just, I mean, it's totally unforeseen territory for us in terms of what we've done. And we actually think that that's our most effective risk mitigation strategy. The more that we take care of our members, the more likely our members will remain healthy and in good financial condition, and that'll translate into a safe and sound balance sheet. So I'll tell you where we're at today is, people often forget that aside from the pandemic, interest rates are virtually at 0. That's not really all that good for banks and credit unions. It's also not good for those of you that are savers. It's great for those of us that borrow money, but it's not a great environment. So our current issue is really a bit of a perfect storm in the sense that we have extremely low interest rates. We have a pandemic that's causing severe financial hardship to our members. And so it's a difficult time. We are starting to see, I think in the current month, consumer borrowing come back a little bit. Not a little bit, actually fairly dramatic, but just still at very depressed levels. We're also seeing the same trends in spending. When we look at credit card and debit card expenditures, we're starting to see those come back a little bit, but again, at lower levels. We've just recently readjusted our branch access. We're now allowing members back into the branch lobbies on a by appointment limited basis. We're still keeping people at home that can work from home. We'll continue to do so. And we're watching, those forbearance and loan deferments and ultimately to see how they translate into delinquencies and hopefully not charge-offs. And we are fully expecting a decline in both earnings and capital. Capital is essentially that net income that we earn on an annual basis that we don't necessarily return directly to our members, but we keep literally in the credit union for these exact reasons. You save up your capital when times are good, and you spend it down when times are bad to protect your members to a greater extent, and that's what we're doing. So we fully expect capital to go down. In terms of what's going to be, I'll finish on what I think will be important as we look at our operations going forward and how we'll respond to it. There are some things that are just unique to the banking industry. The consumers have been moving to digital delivery of services for some time. That's going to get accelerated. We've been evolving the role of branches and in-person services for some time. That's being accelerated. And, the emphasis on efficiency, the reality is that size is actually going to become increasingly important. It's not the most important thing, but operating an efficient organization in the current environment and an environment that will probably be with us for some time is going to continue to be really important for us. The notion of operating, many of you have heard the term VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Honestly, I think that environment is going to be with us for some time, and making sure that you're operating on a resilient basis is even more important in that kind of environment. My kids jokingly refer to everything that we're going through right now as some big video game, and we've made it to level 4, and now we got to see what level 5 brings us, right? We've made it to the next level, so let's see what the next level. And I think there's always going to be another level, at least for the foreseeable future. So within all of that, the most important thing to us and what we believe matters the most is our commitment to values, to purpose, and to purposeful action. We frankly think that doubling down on our values, doubling down on our purpose and our mission, and our structure as a member-owned co-op is going to be more important than ever, because the environment's just getting increasingly more difficult, more complex, and more volatile. And so committing to those values are based on social and environmental impact, on financial inclusion, on serving underserved and unserved communities, and on diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial justice in the current environment and for the foreseeable future, are only more important today than they were even 3 or 4 months ago, and will continue to get nothing but more important as we move forward. So, our view is to try to seek ways. We are not very big in the scheme of things nationally, but we actually, within Vermont and within the region we operate, do have decent sized scale. And so our purpose is to figure out how do we leverage that scale, our resources, our people, our branches, our distribution, our capital, particularly our capital, to really have that positive and sustainable and resilient impact on the people and the members that we serve within the communities that they live in. And that's our challenge and our opportunity moving forward. So I'll leave it there, turn it over to Addie, and I'll take your questions afterwards.
All right. Thank you both. I'll just get my screen shared here. Can everyone see that? Thumbs up? Rob and Matt? Okay, great. Okay, I'm Addie Rose Holland from Real Pickles, and I am, my husband and I were the founders back in 2001, and I'm now a co-owner of the Real Pickles Cooperative. And so I'm going to sort of frame our business as a resilient business, or the importance of being a resilient business through the frame of sort of the current crises that we are in, that we're facing right now. The original theme of the Slow Living Summit was climate, and that's certainly something that we think a lot about. And then COVID is in the forefront of our minds right now, and then also racial and social justice. So we are in Greenfield, Mass, just south of Brattleboro, and we make fermented vegetables, pickles, sauerkraut, kimchi, and other good stuff. This is our group of owners from a couple of years ago, and we transitioned to a co-op in 2013, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about why we made that decision and why it has helped us model our business for resilience. So one of the first reasons was that we were looking at the natural foods business landscape and seeing businesses get big, sell out, and any mission that might have been meaningful initially may or may not make it through that transition. We have a really strong mission to promote human and ecological health by providing people with delicious, nourishing food, and by working toward a regional organic food system. Climate is a really big piece of that. So reducing food miles is something that we take really seriously. We buy all our vegetables from farms in the Northeast, but primarily from within 40 miles of our facility. And we only sell our finished product within that same region, so within the Northeast US. If somebody tries to order from California or Ohio, we won't ship it out. And that's from a commitment to reduce our carbon footprint. We also take energy conservation and efficiency and renewables very seriously. We have 2 solar arrays on our building, and even with increasing production, we've been able to keep our electricity 100% solar, which we're pretty proud of. Secondly, we wanted to create incentives for our staff to stay for the long term. We wanted to really build a thriving staff team, and by transitioning to a worker co-op, we're able to share both decision making and profits with the staff, which helps in both directions. And we have built an incredible, committed, skilled staff team. We also saw a worker transitioning to a worker co-op as a potential succession strategy. I mean, eventually a succession strategy where the founders, my husband and I, would eventually leave the business, but the business would carry on and be viable and very strong. We also have many different, we are very lucky to be in a region, be in a place, as are all the residents of Vermont, where we have local independent banks. We have great relationships with our local banks. We have great relationships with community lending institutions, and especially, as Rob mentioned, with the payroll protection loans, we were just so thankful for our local bank that they were able to pull through for us and so many others on that. And then we also have this other financing, this group of incredible community investors that we took on during our transition. And then we accepted a few more in the last year or so. And these investors, many of them are core supporters and core partners in our business operations. Some are farmers, some are our stores, and they deeply care about our mission, and they also care about how we're doing. And so during the COVID, right at the beginning of the COVID crisis, I sent an email out to the investors kind of explaining initial impacts as we understood them to our business, and I got several emails back saying, how can we help? Which feels pretty good. So we also are committed to our community. So part of being a worker co-op is we want to support our community. We're rooted here. Our workers live here. They're not going to move the business somewhere else because this is their job. They're protecting their jobs in the community. And so we're able to keep profits local and support good jobs in our community and our local farms. We also have sort of we have a provision in our bylaws where if something happens, the business can't make it, we sell or have to sell off, then the owners can't reap the profits from that. We have to donate those profits. And so there's this mitigated profit motive, which helps to build this culture of long-term community-oriented thinking and action. So I'm just going to offer a few examples of how we are contributing to building a resilient community. Just by being here and being a resilient business and focusing on the resilience of our business, we think that's the most important thing we can do to contribute to resilience in our community. And being place-based, I mentioned, we're keeping profits and jobs in the community. From a climate lens, we have been thinking a lot about climate adaptation planning lately to strengthen and increase the resilience of our business. And basically what this means is strengthening and supporting the regional food system. So farms, distributors, stores in the region that are getting regionally produced food to people in the region. And so this is a huge piece of, especially after the 2018 harvest season, which was really terrible for a lot of the farms that we work with, looking at where the opportunities are to strengthen this community has been really important. As Rob mentioned, being adaptable is so important. because we have this committed and skilled staff that have so many perspectives and creative thoughts, we were able to be nimble to the constantly changing conditions with COVID. The national distribution networks were pretty severely disrupted as everyone was going out to shop and try to get enough food to get them through a few weeks. And we were hearing from our stores that they were just having a horrible time keeping supply on the shelf and getting the things that they really needed. But we were able to keep our products on the shelf at all our stores. We were able to ship out, deliver, whatever we needed to do to get the product out there, and the stores were really thankful for that. To bring in the co-op principles, we have a lot of concern for our community, and I'll just put in from a justice angle, we started as a very white organization, and in recent years, and largely through the insistence of our members, we've put a lot of effort into diversifying our staff in a variety of different measures. And we also are doing a lot of work on the board level and in our staff culture to think a lot about, re-examine what our business culture is and what we value, and wanting to really make sure that everyone who works at Real Pickles feels truly included and comfortable. And then lastly, open membership is another co-op principle. Access is really important to us. We have a lot of diversity in our skill level at the company. We have a lot of entry-level opportunities. So there's a lot of ways that we can bring in people who maybe don't have the experience but can learn it quickly. And I want to share one example. Is we partnered with a local jail in Greenfield for a program called Back to Work, where we were able to hire an inmate while he was still in incarceration, and he worked with us for several months before his release date. And the idea was that it would help his transition back to community, and that he could have a stable job that he was used to being in upon his release. And that's exactly what happened. That was a few years ago. He's still with us, and he's an owner now. And we're really proud of what he's accomplished and how we've been able to help him. So yeah, I think I'll stop there and we can answer questions.
All right, so thank you all for your presentations. So, you know, for folks who are attending, if you'd like to sort of put any questions in through the Q&A system, you're welcome to. I know we've received a few, but before we get into audience questions, I just wanted to sort of invite any of the panelists, if you heard something or something that sparked a thought or a question for you from one of the others, just an invitation to a little bit of dialogue. And I do have one if nothing comes to mind for any of you.
Oh, go ahead, Matt.
So one thing that kind of Addie and Bonnie both alluded to in terms of the kind of resilience question, and this is both kind of in the short term with, you know, thinking about how symbolic toilet paper became at the end of March, right? In terms of, oh, well, can you even get it? You know, supply chain issues, that sort of thing. But kind of more generally, there's the ability to respond to crises, and then there's the sort of ability to be proactive in building different kinds of structures that mean communities are more resilient. So those food co-ops being able to readily go to their suppliers and say, okay, well, what can we substitute in? And, you know, what do you have extra of? And having that flexibility that might not exist in other contexts. So do you want to talk a little bit about kind of what the sort of strategizing looks like in terms of saying, okay, well, what are those things that we can do when it's not a crisis that can make things more resilient? And how do you kind of, like, you know, that can feel sometimes like an expense or extra work in times when it's not immediately necessary. So how do you kind of think through, how does your co-op model kind of influence your approach to that sort of proactive resilience building.
I can share an example from the food co-op world, which is one of the things that food co-ops have been doing over the last, really focused over the last decade, is looking at making sure, like, what are the barriers to every family in our community being able to afford healthy groceries? And so in response, Neighboring Food Co-op Association brought together our food co-op members for monthly planning calls, and they rolled out needs-based discount programs at all of our co-ops, which means, in most cases, the 10% off pretty much everything in the store every time you shop at our food co-ops for folks with limited income. And so those programs are already in place. But because of the structure of our co-ops, when things like a crisis occurs, they're able to shift and look at those programs and adapt really quickly. So for example, Littleton Food Co-op up in northern New Hampshire that opened just over 10 years ago, they looked at their needs-based discount program and their qualifiers, which include, SNAP, WIC, SSI, a number of other qualifiers, and they said, we're opening this up and creating they very quickly created a new program for anyone that had been unemployed could now get this 10% discount. So that's one example. And then another co-op learned about it on a call, and they were like, oh, well, let's just incorporate this into our larger need-based discount program. So that's an example of, like, the co-ops were already building these programs, but overnight the strategy was like, okay, how can we keep pushing ourselves? What barriers still exist, and how can we respond and adapt? And, our co-ops are collectively, since these programs have been in place, have given millions of dollars of these needs-based discounts, right? And a profit-driven grocery store would never do that. It just wouldn't make sense when profit's your bottom line. So that's just one example. And I want to hear from the other panelists.
Yeah, I would expand the concept of these supply chains to be something something beyond just what we think of when we think of traditional supply chains. Because I'll give you an example of our member emergency loan that we started providing at the beginning of the crisis and still are today, that provides small dollar loans at 0% financing rates. And we're able to do that up to a certain amount and up to a certain scale based on our risk tolerances. But we were able to partner with other local organizations, in this case, the Vermont Community Foundation, Let's Grow Kids, and the North Bennington Fund, to add additional capacity to buy down the rate, to make the rate available at 0%, because we are all grounded in the communities that we serve, and we're close to those communities. And so, people who have discretionary income may donate, if you will, to the Vermont Community Foundation. The Vermont Community Foundation partners with VSECU to buy down the rate and to expand the capacity of the member emergency loan program, which then gets invested in the people that need the money in the community, and reallocating and recirculating, if you will, that money within the community, and try to get it to the people that need it the most. So I think those supply chains can be actual supply chains, and then they can be network, if you will, supply chains. And we've seen that in our green lending program. We're one of the leading green lenders in the state, and we do that in partnership with the installers and the contractors of solar and energy efficiency and all that, which brings us really close to the activity and allows us to learn and modify and adjust and adapt, fairly real time as a result of those connections, because we're all operating within the communities that we serve in real time.
Great. Addie?
Yeah, so I think Rob made a really clear point in his presentation about building capital, and that during good times you build capital, and so that you can use it during bad times. And that's definitely something we've kept at the forefront over the last bunch of years. We're constantly evaluating scenarios, financial scenarios of like, okay, what if this happens? What if that happens? And we're, projecting out many years, and it's also arbitrary in some ways, but it gives us the practice of like, okay, if something happens, where are the quick opportunities to rebound, to, not do this activity and do this other thing. And I think that, one thing that became clear with COVID was that things changed so quickly that we were either resilient or we weren't resilient. And there was no time to like figure out, there was no time to sort of like build in the ability to respond. It either was there or it wasn't. And, and we'll see what happens. but I think we've been able to respond pretty well. And I think I saw Vermont NOFA came through my inbox recently, and it said resilience is relationships. And that really resonated with me, that like, it's with our staff primarily, like our staff, because they trust what we're doing. Because we have this strong communication, and that we've been building this workplace democracy culture, that they're participating in a lot of the decisions that we're making. I think it was a few people didn't feel comfortable coming back to work, even though we were putting all the policies in place to keep people safe, to continue packing pickles. But a lot of people did, and we've been able to continue producing product because of that. And I think that's trust, that's relationships, that's we've been building that for a long time.
Great. So so there's a question here, or it's kind of a few questions, but they're all kind of interconnected around around specifically converting a business to a worker co-op. And so as a practitioner who works on those sorts of things, I'll kind of run through them. And then, Addie, having gone through the process as kind of being on both the sell side as a co-founder, but also on the buy side as a worker owner, maybe you can share just a little bit of your personal experience on this. But so questions are, how many employees might it take to establish a cooperative ownership agreement? That's a minimum of 3, I think, core folks who are interested and willing to drive it, I think is a baseline. It's a model that can work for fairly small businesses. So I set that as kind of the floor. What criteria should an existing owner consider before presenting the concept of a cooperative to employees? Certainly, I think it's good to have done a little bit of preliminary feasibility assessment to say, okay, well, what realistically is the value? Could that value be financed effectively? What's the cash flow like? And that kind of shades in the next question, which is what options for financing are there? So there's definitely some friendly capital sources that exist to support the conversion of businesses to cooperatives. The most known and experienced in the region, who our organization often works with on these deals, is the Cooperative Fund of New England. They're a CDFI that was originally founded by food co-ops, putting some of their surplus into a shared fund, and that's grown to be able to make loans of up to $1 million at this point. And then there's a variety of other kind of more modest sources. Actually, VSECU does have a co-op capital fund that has a pool of equity that is interested in investing in cooperatives and that sort of thing. So, and there's usually some seller financing involved. So a seller either just holding a note, or maybe an earnout where they sort of share in kind of some of the upside or downside for a few years as part of that. And then the final question: how many exist in Vermont now? I believe the last count was I think 16 worker co-ops in Vermont in a variety of sectors. There's a physical therapy co-op. There's a Green Mountain Spinnery. There's a solar installation co-op. There's kind of chocolate and granola manufacturing co-op. There's a herbalism clinic. So it's all kind of over the map in terms of sectors. But yeah, Addie, do you want to just talk for a minute or two on kind of like what the experience of kind of making that transition was like?
Yeah, I'll just run through the questions too. In terms of number of employees, I might go with Matt on 3. We figured we needed 5 in order to make the transition really work, and so you could say that was the 2 of us plus 3 additional people. We just felt like the amount of conversation that needed to happen to kind of figure out all the details and move it forward, that if there weren't a minimum of 5 of us making that commitment, at least to think about it, to go down the road, that felt like a good number. And we were able, we got exactly 5 to do the initial work. What criteria? I'd agree, valuation, at least some initial thoughts about valuation, even if it's not the sort of final decision. The decision obviously needs to be made with everybody, both buyers and sellers. And options for financing, we used a combination of a loan from the Cooperative Fund of New England, as well as our community investor network. And so we accepted investments through a direct public offering, and which was very well received by our community, and people seemed really excited to put their money into this kind of activity.
Okay, yeah, and there's also a comment we have someone from CFNE on the call, Maggie, who said, as funder, we'd like to see more than 5 to allow for some attrition. And that can be something where there's definitely a difference in needing to be a little more formal if you have kind of an outside lender versus primarily relying on what the employees can bring to the table, which is often a relatively small portion of the deal, and seller financing. So there can be some variability there. So the next question, which I'll sort of I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts on, is kind of a big picture one. Can you speak to the future of building a cooperative economy as a whole across different types of co-ops in collaboration with other co-ops and credit unions? So just how do we get more co-ops? How do we have more of the economy operating on a cooperative basis? What are the things that's being done, and what would you like to see being done that's maybe not already being done? So maybe Bonnie, do you want to start that off?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's exciting to be on this panel with Rob and Addie, because we're kind of representing some of these different sectors of that make up the cooperative economy, right? So when you go into our food co-ops, you'll find Real Pickles on the shelves, right, that are made by a producer co-op, and Addie could purchase from a growers co-op or a farmer co-op like Deep Root Organic that grows, right? And then Rob could get on financing through credit union. So we really can create an integrated cooperative economy that's built on the values and principles that we've been discussing, right? And so one example is that with neighboring food co-ops, we're exploring a partnership with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives down in the South, which the purpose is to keep land and in the hands of Black farmers, and that's been around for over 50 years, right? And we're looking at, can we purchase from them and support them, because our mission and our vision is aligned to this thriving cooperative economy. And I think we also partner with Valley Alliance of Worker Co-ops that supports growing worker co-ops in our region, and also the New England Farmers Union. A bunch of the supplies and infrastructure is owned by co-ops across the country. So thinking about, part of our vision is a thriving cooperative economy. So it's, as staff and at our food co-ops, we think about, when we're purchasing a product, is it coming from another cooperative? Can we invest in another cooperative? So I think that's definitely part of the initial founder's vision that you mentioned, Matt, is not just collectively owning one piece of the economy, but how can we collaborate together and support all these different cooperative structures so that our communities collectively own the infrastructure, the economy, the food system, the institutions to create the kind of world that we want to see, right?
Rob, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think so. It's awesome these conversations are happening as we speak. I sit on the governor's economic recovery mitigation task force, and I'm involved in the Vermont Community Foundation in a similar effort. And there's these great discussions that are only starting to happen about what does the economy look like and how can we make it more resilient and more just post-crisis. Because if the crisis has done anything, it's really highlighted where those injustices are and where those gaps are, and where our economy isn't as efficient or as resilient as it ought to be. And I think that cooperative economy kind of comprises two components, and certainly more cooperatives, and I think ownership does matter. And to the extent that we can facilitate more local and ownership where that ownership is close to the operation as possible, but also cooperation within our economy. And I think that we're really seeing this today, where consumers are actively, that have the resources, are trying to figure out how they can support their local businesses, whether they're cooperatives or not. We're seeing this mostly, I think, right now with restaurant businesses and to a certain extent retail. But I refer to it as sort of, we have to figure out how to de-Amazon ourselves a little bit, right? Amazon is so easy, which is what makes them so powerful. But as opposed to hitting that send button, just go to the local hardware store and buy what you need there. And so there's a bit of a developing new habits, if you will, getting back to, sort of the way things were some time ago, and really supporting one another, with our wallets. And that's the most effective thing. And we talk about this all the time, what can build a really, truly, resilient, vibrant economy it isn't any one thing that we do as consumers. It's all the little things that we do. And when you do all those little things right, they add up and they can make a big difference. And somehow we got to figure out how to put the systems and the processes in place, but also, really the educational and for lack of a better term, marketing to really encourage our local residents to take that into account.
Thanks, Rob. Addie?
Yeah, great points. So Bonnie and Rob. I guess I just want to bring in the silver tsunami and the retirement of the baby boomers. We've heard from a lot of people just in our own little business community, just folks that we know or are a few steps removed from who there's just been a lot of interest in this idea of succession through transition to a cooperative. And some have moved on to do it, and others it just hasn't made sense, or there wasn't quite the interest from the workers. But it's so inspiring to hear it anytime I hear the thread of some conversation like that happening. It just seems like a tremendous opportunity, especially for a business where there's employees who have been there for a whole career, who know the business inside and out, and it would just be a perfect opportunity to grow the ownership in the community and make that. And often it's the difference between a business staying in the community and disappearing, which is really sad.
Yeah. So one other, one other thing I think is relevant to this question is kind of somewhat inherent to almost the structure of co-ops, right? Is that if our goal is to center this kind of use, this patronage, rather than profit, then what is how do we kind of bring together the resources necessary to to grow the economy in a way that competes with those companies that exist to drive profit and create larger and larger capital formations. And so traditionally with co-ops, it's been primarily a question of retained earnings. Like Rob was talking about, that sort of each year, sort of retaining a little bit of additional capital, building up some member investment, right? But putting in those shares. But oftentimes those shares, as Bonnie was pointing out, are relatively small. The $150 average for the food co-op share. And so when you're kind of competing against folks like the Amazons of the world, which can raise an enormous amount of investment capital on the premise that they can operate at a loss for a time, push a bunch of folks out of business, and then reap the long-term rewards through monopoly pricing, right? There's this kind of, how do we start to sort of tip the balance so that we actually have enough capital in the movement to be able to really kind of go toe to toe in some sectors. And I think there's like a few things that I've personally explored and would love to see kind of expanding. One is this question, and I definitely encourage everyone to check out the Sustainable Economies Law Center, which is based in Oakland, California, and is doing a lot of great innovative work around kind of various forms of solidarity economy organizing. Whether it's in terms of like the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Co-op. But one of the projects that they've been working on is the Next Egg project, which is encouraging people to, essentially divest their retirement savings from extractive enterprise and invest it in their communities, and particularly in co-ops. And so that can look like, having your retirement account, instead of it being in a Vanguard index fund, it's invested in, Real Pickles preferred shares and the Cooperative Fund of New England and your food co-ops, member loan campaign, and local real estate co-op. So these kinds of, even for a lot of people, there's these default mechanisms of just, even if it's against your values, just channel capital back into the very, very things we want to create alternatives to. So I think a key question is, what are the various ways we can divert those flows to sort of strengthening things at a faster rate than that intergenerational gradual accumulation of capital? So, the Cooperative Fund of New England is so vital, and so many, the work that we do, to help folks convert to worker co-ops would be so much harder if we didn't have them to point to say, like, look, it's feasible. There is this resource out there that understands this model and is going to come to the table and be more flexible than a traditional lender would be. So it's possible, even if you the employees don't have a lot in your pockets right now. And building it up to the size it is, which is, it's I think between $30 and $40 million in assets at this point, took 40 years, right? And hopefully it's going to keep compounding, growing, becoming a greater and greater strength in our region. But like, I think strategically we need to be growing those pools of friendly capital faster and faster. So I think that sort of, that source of disadvantage can start to shift into a source of strength if we can be successful at that. So that's what I would want to kind of throw out there. And there's another question I think, Bonnie, you'd be the obvious person to answer, but can you speak, my community is losing our only grocery store. What would be the first steps for us to start organizing to create a food co-op to replace it?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And we're seeing that more and more with the consolidation of the grocery industry. There was a bunch of supernatural stores that are, like Lucky's chains that were acquired by Kroger. And then Kroger was like, hey, by the way, we're out, drop the mic, and closing all these stores overnight. And so what we're seeing, right? And then they don't ask the community, they don't talk to the community, they close their doors overnight. So that's happening across the country. And in response, people are organizing food co-ops. A third of our members of the Neighboring Food Co-op Association are startups. And these startups are reflecting what's happening in our society right now, right? They are centering their reason for organizing around racial and economic justice. So I think I sent you a link, but Food Co-op Initiative is a great place to start. They have a manual. I read it front to back as your first step, and then shoot me an email with questions, and I'd be happy to connect you. That's really the first step. It's got case studies. It's got an overview of what it requires to start a food co-op. And I'll just share, that's how I got into this movement, is starting a food co-op in Keene, New Hampshire. Partly for the motivation of serving as the year-round stable market for farmers in the region that, you know, they had over 400 farmers in the region without a year-round stable market. And so 4 years of community organizing later, we opened the Monadnock Food Co-op that's now expanding and meeting the need of their community. So it does, you know, as Matt alluded to before, it does take time and resources, but you would be in really good company. There are communities across the country right now that are organizing startup food co-ops, and there are the resources available now that weren't available when I was organizing 10 years ago are incredible. So let us know how we can help, but Food Co-op Initiative, their resources and their manual is a great place to start for anyone who's interested.
And I'll throw one other piece of just kind of advice, having been through the experience of helping get a consumer co-op started, is first of all, sort of having realistic expectations about time frame, right? It's something that, you know, is, unless you're, say, like acquiring the store that's closing, it's oftentimes something that's going to take, you know, at least a few years to, you know, build momentum, you know, get the community buy-in, get enough members together, sort of build your business plan. You know, it's that it can be challenging. And one thing that, in retrospect, having been sort of involved in those, that I think, you know, and related to that kind of that same question of capital as well, that I think is worth thinking about, is if there's a core of folks who are involved and excited at the beginning, figuring out some way to have them be, you know, in a consistent way, starting to accumulate a pool of money that eventually could go to helping it start. Whether that's like a bunch of people all say, all right, we're all going to put $25 or $50 a month into a pot, and we'll throw that pot in the Cooperative Fund of New England to earn a little bit of interest. And when the food co-op's ready for it, suddenly we have, you know, essentially a down payment saved up. And if it's something that ultimately runs out of steam, you know, we can take our money back. But that sort of thing that can kind of, oftentimes with these sorts of campaigns, if it's a longer term thing, you can kind of have these times where, you know, morale flags, and there's the sense of, oh, we raised a little bit of money and then we've had to spend it on a bunch of stuff, and where are we at? Whereas being able to kind of point to, hey, look, we have more resources here now than we had 6 months ago or a year ago, to sort of get the sense that you're starting to roll a snowball forward, and the snowball is getting bigger as time goes on. So I think that thinking about that as a strategy to sort of engage people it could be a useful one.
Matt, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry. We're coming up about 10 minutes before our scheduled end time. So I invite any other questions or comments people have to submit them. And maybe we can do a quick kind of closing round of final thoughts, or just things that have come up for our panelists that haven't been that, you know, either haven't been covered or that has gotten you thinking. So we have one more question here. Some established co-ops have also bought the closing community grocery. Co-op food store successfully purchased White River Junction store, for example. Yeah, so that question of kind of acquisitions. Bonnie, do you have any sort of stories or thoughts on kind of the acquisition route versus the startup route in the food co-op world?
I can share that story, which is a great story. So one of our oldest food co-ops in this region, Hanover Consumer Cooperative Society, also known as Co-op Food Stores, which has one location in Hanover, one location in Lebanon, and one location in White River Junction. Well, at the time they had two food co-op store locations, and a chain grocery store in White River Junction, their neighboring community, was closing. And people reached out to them and said, you know, hey, people are gonna lose jobs overnight. People are gonna lose food access. What can we do? Can you help? There's also another food co-op in White River Junction that already exists, Upper Valley Food Co-op. And so Upper Valley Food Co-op and Co-op Food Stores immediately came into conversation so that they would make sure that they were working in cooperation and collaboratively. But the Co-op Food Stores worked to take this store that was going to close and have to fire their employees, and they were able to incorporate it into their cooperative. So now it's one of the it's part of the food co-op, the co-op food stores, and it was able, jobs were able to be saved, and it was able to keep and maintain that infrastructure that would have been lost overnight to that community. So that just happened at one of the Lucky's chains closed in another part of the country, and Oriana Food Co-op was able to immediately take it over because they had been saving up capital. They were planning to expand. So that opportunity of keeping things or expanding the cooperative ownership of community infrastructure is a huge opportunity that I think we need to keep exploring, in addition to the conversion model that Addie's cooperative Real Pickles represents.
Great, thank you for sharing that. All right, so yeah, let's move into just kind of a closing round of final thoughts, and maybe I'll reverse our order from before. So Addie, do you want to go first? Any last things you'd want to share or reactions to what you've heard?
This has been such a great conversation. I love hearing Bonnie speak and Rob speak and Matt. I just love having these conversations about the possibilities of the cooperative economy growing, and when I think about it too, sort of in my head, it's like, oh, it's so idealized, and can we really get there? But then it's like, no, we are doing it. Like, it's happening, and there's a lot of really great things happening. There's a lot of truly positive impact in our communities, and so it's just great to be part of these conversations and know that we're part of a movement to make the world a better place. So thank you both, and thanks everyone for listening.
Great, Rob?
Well, like Addie, I appreciate the opportunity for a little inspiration in my day. It's been a rough couple months, and it's inspiring to think that we might actually have the motivation, for lack of a better term, to envision a different world post-crisis, but it's still rough going through it right now. So I appreciate the opportunity to think a bit big with you guys and think about what things could be and how we do change the world together. So that's my appreciation to all of you. Thank you.
Great. Bonnie?
And I'll build on this. I think, both of my esteemed, amazing panelists, co-op panelists, also mentioned this, like right now, collective vision is so important, right? There is so much hopelessness. There's so much reason to be hopeless, yet there's also so much reason to be hopeful. And it's this thought of like, if we only accept what we see before us, we will never change what we see, right? But if we are imagining collectively, like just think about what can happen in our communities if we work to build businesses that are owned and controlled by our communities and accountable to our communities, and that place values at their core. And I think that's what we've been talking about today, hearing lots of examples of that. That's what gives me hope for how we can rebuild community resilience and look at the challenges ahead with a shared strategy that really is about building power in our communities, keeping power in our communities, and sharing power in our communities. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks to the Slow Living Summit for organizing this, and thanks to Matt and my fellow co-op panelists.
Thank you, Bonnie. Yeah, and I guess I would just close by saying, again, yeah, this has been a great conversation, and it's always fun to be able to get into that little bit about that big picture vision when the nose is usually to the grindstone. I just encourage the folks who've been watching and who will watch this, and are interested in getting more involved. There's a variety of resources out there, and in terms of going further down these rabbit holes around which direction of getting involved in starting in building the co-op economy is kind of interests you. So Urban Crowell, I saw in the Q&A, posted a link to Neighboring Food Co-ops Association has a website for food co-op startups. That's a great place to look at for worker co-ops if you're interested in that. Certainly you you can reach out to us at if you're in Vermont, the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, VEOC.org. There's also nationally the Democracy at Work Institute, which has a wonderful resource library to kind of to research and learn about how these things work. And then there's the other resource in our region that provides a lot of support to people who are trying to start co-ops is the Cooperative Development Institute, or CDI.coop. And there's all kinds of co-ops they have resources around, whether it's worker co-ops, consumer co-ops, housing co-ops. It's a great group of people who do a lot of great work and can be quite supportive. And then, of course, just that, like, if you're wanting to put your money to work in the cooperative economy, the Cooperative Fund of New England does fantastic work in our region. There's a few other sort of funds that are like that, like Shared Capital Cooperative, Leaf Fund, which is kind of based out of Boston. And there's kind of a small but growing universe of ways to sort of have folks put their money where their values are to support growing the cooperative economy. So, this is, I think, really both, hopefully an inspiration and an invitation to, to lend your shoulder to the effort. So thank you again.
I just want to thank you again to all of our panelists. Rob, I think if you're CEO of a co-op, maybe you're a cool cat and not other kinds of cats. So I think you get a pass. Such a great conversation today. So happy to have everyone here, and just so many things that were brought up. And I'm sure that folks will have questions later on as well. So I just want to say that we are happy to connect any of the folks on the panel to anybody, any of the attendees, in any way that you feel comfortable sharing your information. So if there's follow-ups afterwards, you can just email me at slowlivingsummit.com, and we'd be happy to make that connection for anybody. But this was just so interesting, and co-ops work in ways that I didn't even understand. So this, for me, was really an eye-opening thing. So yeah, I want to thank the attendees as well for showing up today. And again, we're hoping that everyone can join us for the happy hour tomorrow evening. You can come with your ginger beer or your actual beer, whatever you'd like. It's BYOB. And again, just so happy to have these great conversations going on all week, and we have 2 more days of this. So thanks again. Melissa, did you want to say thank you to anyone else?
You said it all. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, attendees, for listening. And we really appreciate all of you. Thanks so much. Have a great night.
Thank you.